everyone. I'm Ellie Kim. I've been so looking forward to this symposium, and I'm so honored to serve as moderator. First, I'd like to remind you again, we have a Q&A session after presentation, so we hope to have many intriguing questions and comments from the audience. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Stella Su. She is Korean professor at Roanoke College in Virginia. She is one of a few scholars who is an expert in ancient Korean history. She's been contributing to the field of Korean studies through her excellent research and teachings. Recently, she expanded her research topic to the early Korea-US relations from the late 19th century to early 20th century. Through today's lecture, she will take us to very historical and cultural origins of Korea-US alliance through footsteps of the missionaries. Please welcome Professor Stella Su.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for a kind introduction, and I'm so honored to be here. And today I'm going to share some beautiful stories about how do we think of where the friendship of the United States and Korea started. So I'm going to share three beautiful stories. One is about missionaries, and he was a Canadian missionary, but he turned to a US missionary, and James Gale. And next, I'm going to share a story about Mrs. Lee Chae-yeon, who was the wife of a Korean minister, Charity Fair ministers in 1890s. And the third, I'm going to share stories about Laney Davis, who was one of the first Southern Presbyterian missionaries to Korea. I just returned from my research trip in Asia 5 days ago. This year, we received Asian Network Student Faculty Fellowship, and we conducted 3 weeks field research in Korea from May 26th to June 15th. Our research topic is the legacy of American Protestant missionaries in contemporary South Korea. When we were in Korea, we also received media attention because one of the key components of our research in Korea is Kim Gyu-sik and Horace Underwood. Kim Gyu-sik graduated from Roanoke College in 1903. So it was a very heart-melting report by reporters from Joseon Daily, and he actually named our students, Roanoke College students, as 우리 선배님의 한미 동맹 원조, 태평양 건너온 김규식의 120년 후배들. So he was naming our Roanoke College students as the junior of Kim Gyu-sik, who studied at Roanoke College 120 years ago. So today I'm going to focus on one of the first missionaries, James Gale, who was an extremely important missionary, but often get very little attention. So when people talk about his profession, he was remembered as a missionary, a scholar, and a translator. There are many people who contribute to the translation of Korean Bibles, but there is no question that James Gale made significant contributions. James Gale came to Korea as a Canadian missionary in 1888, and later he joined U.S. Northern Presbyterian Mission. His missionary work is special, yet at least in two ways. One, he generally believed that missionaries should accommodate Korean culture and preach in ways that Koreans can understand and accept. He was open-minded to embrace all Koreans regardless of their gender and class. In particular, he was proactive to receive Baekjeong, an outcast group, to his congregation, despite strong opposition from aristocratic Yangban class. Along with Underwood and Appenzeller, James Gale had greatly invested in producing a good translation of Korean Bible. He insisted to use Hananim, a Korean term that is proper for one God, instead of using other Chinese terms. During our field research in Korea, we visited Yeondong Church, where Gale served as pastor for over 3 decades. And the congregation still loved him, and preserved a small exhibit in commemoration of the legacy of missionaries. Gale's another tremendous contribution to Korea is his scholarship in Korean studies. He is quite different from other missionaries for his deep interest and profound understanding of Korean classics. Gale was not only interested in collecting Korean books, but also translating many of them into English. Thanks to Dr. Ali Kim at the Library of Congress, I was able to take a closer look at the James Gale collection. So here, there are letters he wrote in 1925, and these letters shows James Gale's intentional, deliberate arrangement to donate his books to the Library of Congress. His donated collection became the beginning of the Korean collection at the Library of Congress, and as this is the dictionary he helped to compile, and here are all the list of his Korean book catalogs he donated later on to the Library of Congress. I'm going to share one of his notes here, dated in 1927. So he wrote, "The books mentioned here grow more and more rare as years go by. Only a matter of time that it would seem that the very memory of them would be forgotten, and yet they are Korea's more noble monuments of all her past history." So this actually shows his reason to collect all those Korean books and his hope for preserving those books for Korean culture for future generations. Korean scholars today appraised that Gale's understanding of Korean classics had matched, if not surpassed, Korean scholars of his contemporaries. And here, I'm going to show one of his comparative timeline Gale compiled in placing Korean history in relation to world history. So in that unpublished manuscript, so basically he lists other important world history events and also put the Korean chronology there so that people can get a good understanding of what happened outside of Korea and what happened in Korea as well. And anyone would be deeply impressed of his scholarship and also his effort, his invested effort in making these kind of scholarships on Korean history and culture. Now I'm going to move to talk about, many people then think about the beginning of Koreans in the United States. They talk about 1903, the Korean plantation laborers came to Hawaii, but I'm going to start something that is like earlier. So it's about the US-Korean relationship started in 1892. I'm sure many of you have never heard of Roanoke College, but Roanoke College is a small liberal arts college in Southwest Virginia. When I started working there, I was surprised by 3 facts. One, a small liberal arts college in Southwest Virginia can have such an open mind to host students from thousands of miles away across the Pacific Ocean from Korea. Korean students did not only do well but in academic achievements, but also being welcomed as a member of community, and they have been proactive in many college activities. And also from 1890s to 1930s, there are 34 students who studied at Roanoke College. Obviously, they are almost the whole first generation of Korean students studied at Roanoke College. So where did this all start? We have to trace to Dr. Julius Dreyer. He was the third president of Ronald College. In March 1892, he decided to do a little more research about Korea. At that time, he happened to be in Washington, D.C. for a business trip. So basically, he walked to a Korean legation at that time, and he knocked the door. At that time, the person who welcomed him, who greeted him, was Korean Charity Fair Minister, Mr. Lee Cha-yeon. He warmly welcomed him, and they had a very pleasant conversation. Actually, Dr. Dreyer, he says that we are a college in Virginia, and we are ready, and we want to host Korean students. Do you want to send some over? And Mr. Lee Cha-yeon says, oh, thank you so much for coming. Actually, we are in the process of trying to look for proper colleges so that we can send Korean boys. So upon Dr. Dreyer's invitation, Mr. and Mrs. Lee Cha-yeon visited Ronald College in July 1892. They stayed in Salem for 1 week. They concluded, after 1 week field research, they concluded that Ronald College was indeed a very suitable college for Korean students to study. And then the first Korean students who came in January 1894. The first Korean students who studied at Ronald College, his name is Seo Byung-gyu. He was actually the interpreter of Korean booths for the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. He studied 4 years at Ronald College, and he became the first Korean who received a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1897. During this period, almost every Korean minister attended Ronald College commencement and other important events. In particular, Seo Kwang-bom, who was the leader of Korean Enlightenment movement, he was conferred an honorary Master of Arts degree in 1897. And also, the last time Korean minister visited was to celebrate Ronald College semi-centennial in 1903. Kim Gyu-sik, the most famous Korean alum, he also graduated that year. So this is the photo of Seo Byung-gyu, and from there you can tell that our college magazine actually reported that Ronald College in Virginia seems likely to become the educational headquarters of Korea in this country. Seo Byung-gyu of Seoul has been a successful student at Ronald College since January of last year, and now there are another students coming. So these are the list of Korean ministers and the diplomats who visited Ronald College from 1892 to all the way to 1903. If there were no Korean colonization of Japan, this kind of connection may have continued. But unfortunately, due to that dark history of the colonial past, that the connection sort of interrupted and never really fully resumed after. Out of Korean students who studied at Ronald College, Kim Gyu-sik is the most notable one, not only for his highly accomplished career as the leader of Korean independence movement, but also for his love of alma mater. Despite lived in poverty during his exile in China, and the most money he made was used to support Korean independence movement, he actually made a $1,000 donation to Ronald College in 1945, the year that Korea was liberated, but he was still in China at the time, knowing that he would not live too long. Kim Gyu-sik and Seo Byung-gyu contributed numerous articles to the college magazine, Collegium. They not only want to introduce Korean history and cultural customs to their fellow students, but also want to bring attention to the international affairs to Ronald College community. There are many other students who also, Korean students who also studied at Ronald College, and including Prince Yihua, who was the fifth son of King Gozhong, and Yi Gizhong, who was the older brother of Yi Huizhong. Yi Huizhong was one of the 3 Hague delegations in 1903. And during our field research in Korea this summer, we are honored to meet with Yi Jun. He was the grandson of Prince Yihua, and we are honored to have a guided tour of Deoksugung Palace where he was born. And so other notable Korean students include Yin Wen-ik, who invented the first Korean typewriter in 1914, and also Song Hun-ju, who made a great contribution to Korean independence movement in the United States as well. Now, I'm going to start to talk about a very interesting lady, Mrs. Yi Cha-yeon. So he was the wife of Korean Child Welfare Minister, and she also had a special connection with missionaries as well as Ronald College. So it was very rare for Korean diplomats to take their wives or other family members to the United States in the 1880s. And some very rare exceptions were Mr. Yi Cha-yeon and also Mr. Yi Wan-yong. So Mrs. Yi turned out to be an enthusiastic and capable supporter of her husband's diplomatic mission. So she went with her husband to attend the White House New Year celebrations. He also hosted a tea party at the Korean legation and was well attended by Washington, D.C. diplomats and politicians. Thanks to her active role, she was widely reported by the U.S. newspapers in a very positive manner. So here is a quote. Here's a quote from one of the newspapers saying, quote, "Her English is now quite perfect, and there was not the slightest hesitation in starting or sustaining conversation with the many who opposed her, desirous of that pleasure." The media also tried to make a comparison of her with the wife of Chinese minister, quotes, "Mrs. Zi Kuan-yin, wife of the Chinese minister at Washington, D.C., never goes out with her husband. But Mrs. Yi Cha-yeon, the wife of the Korean Child Welfare, left the Korean customs at home and goes almost everywhere her husband goes." So one of, again, her most important visit is that Mrs. Yi visited Ronald College with her husband. She also made a very unusual decision to get baptized when it was still very rare for any high-ranked Koreans to convert to Christianity. So Mrs. Yi made herself the first Korean woman who get baptized in the United States. There is actually another Korean, so this is the baptism records from the Salem Presbyterian Church, and this church is actually about like a 2 minutes drive from my college, and that's the facade of the college and the church. This is the transcription of that baptism records. And another lady I want to highlight is Miss Lenny Davis. She was an American woman who determined to be a missionary, and she actually traveled to Salem from Abingdon. Abingdon is about 2 hours away to the southwest of Salem. She came to Salem because she wants to witness Mrs. Yi's baptism. These two ladies later traveled to Korea together in October 1893, and since then, they become really good friends. So Lenny Davis became a highly respected missionary in Jeonju and Gunsan in southwestern Korea. And this summer, I also visited, so this is the photo of that 7 major Southern Presbyterian missionaries, and then the bottom figure was Lenny Davis. And another photo of her. So in April, I actually visited her home church in Abingdon, Virginia. And that's a church of history of 250 years, so one of the longest, oldest church in that area, the Sinking Spring Presbyterian Church. So Leanie Davis later married to her fellow missionary, William Harrison, and Mr. and Mrs. E were among very few Korean guests who attended the wedding, so that can tell us their deep friendship they had grown since then. So I got to visit Gunsan Guam Church in early June, and Leanie Davis' name was inscribed to one of the 8 columns in the facade of the church building. So this is the cemetery in Jeonju. So she unfortunately passed away when she was only 41, and then she decided to be buried in Korea. And here, not only we were impressed with the friendship, acquaintance between Mrs. E and Leanie Davis, we also see a very interesting comparison between these two figures. So despite Mr. and Mrs. E. Chae-yeon's success as Korean diplomats in Washington, D.C., Mr. E was called back to Korea, where he continued to serve his country in a number of important positions, including mayor of Seoul. Mr. E's recall, however, was a loss for U.S.-Korea relations, as Mr. E was one of the only very few Korean officials whose linguistic skills made him an effective diplomat. As for Mrs. E, despite her pioneering role as the spouse of a Korean diplomat engaged in facilitating her husband's success abroad, she disappeared into obscurity once at home. Her prominence as a public figure in the United States stands in stark contrast to her lack of noteworthiness back in Korea, where we do not even know her full name today, except that her maternal last name was Bae, and then her ancestral seat was Seongju, so she was only known as Seongju Bessie today. The discovery of Mrs. E's baptism certificate is extremely important, not only to the history of Korean Christianity, but also to the history of Korean diplomacy, as well as the history of Korean women in the public sphere. With 2022 marked 140th anniversary of official diplomatic relations between the United States and Korea, we can expect and hope for more research on Mrs. E and the early history of U.S.-Korea diplomacy. Here, I have a few links, and sorry, I cannot show the full articles, but anyway, by discovering this kind of interesting connection, much earlier connection between United States and Korea, I actually contribute to local newspapers about history, and also this is also a critical part of Ronald College, college history as well. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm hoping that my story can get to more of you so that we can treasure more of this long rooted friendship between United States and Korea. And also to me, it's more of I care more of the human to human, people to people, that kind of connection. And this is definitely one of the most beautiful stories that we can recall of the US-Korea friendship. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Now I'd like to open a Q&A session. We have 2 microphones. If you raise your hands, a staff member will hand you a microphone. So we welcome any question and comments for Professor Su. So we have a...
Hello. Thank you for your wonderful presentation, especially about Kim Kyu-sik's presence in Roanoke and his history there, and vis-a-vis Korean-American relations. You know, as we know, and we celebrate here today, the history of Korean-American alliance, of all its benefits and factors that brought us all together in this wonderful room, celebrating in such times. But we also be mindful of things that went the other way or things that didn't turn out as well, such as, when U.S. missionaries came to Korea, they brought education, Western modernization, and all that, enlightenment. So Koreans looked forward to working with Americans and the politicians. And when President Wilson proclaimed the self-determination of nations, that inspired Koreans, saying, yes, we can do that too. We'll be free from Japanese colonialism by using self-determination, and that led to nonviolent civil protests in March 1st movement. And see what happened, the brutal Japanese suppression of their movement. And when that all happened, Americans just stood aside. They didn't really come to Koreans' help. Instead, geopolitically, Japan and U.S. was maneuvering to sort of carve out East Asia for themselves in could be negative way, but U.S. wanted Philippines and Japan wanted Korea, as in the Taft-Katsura agreement that we all know about. So, and in Cairo in 1943, during wartime, the Allies promised Korea to be free and independent in due course. But what does that mean, right? And when 1945 came, towards the end of the war, before the Korean liberation, before the Japan dropped atomic bombs, it was U.S. who proposed partition of Korea. We think that Soviet Union and U.S. agreed to the partition of Korea, but in actuality, that never happened. It was U.S. who initially proposed the partition of Korea in order to get a foothold in Korea militarily to receive Japanese surrender. But that decision, fateful decision, led to chaos, hostilities in Korea, because Koreans were ready for independence. Whether it be left or right or middle of the road, they were trying to work together for Korean independence, finally. But then this division came, and that led to further polarization and division, in which Kim Kyu-shik was a sacrificial lamb, because he was considered one of the leaders of South Korea, could have been a president, and he opted for more neutral, more middle of the road, reconciling left and right. But then U.S. didn't choose Kim Kyu-shik; they chose Syngman Rhee, more right-wing politician, and see what happened here. So that's the whole history that we have to be mindful in thinking about this narrative. So thank you.
Thank you very much for raising this very complicated question, and it's really a question that can push us to think a lot about international relations and then Cold War or pre-Cold War, that kind of circumstance, and as well as colonial legacy. So I want to probably condense your question into two aspects. One is the legacy of the U.S. missionaries, and another is the role of Kim Kyu-shik and how do we see him in inter-Korea relationship as well as today's legacy. As for the that legacy of U.S. missionaries, actually when I decided to write a proposal and then to organize this field research, and there are many topics that I could think of, and eventually I choose the topic of the legacy of U.S. missionaries for many different reasons. But one of the key reasons is that I feel I myself, actually, I did not have very positive feeling about U.S. missionaries before, because definitely, a lot of people are very critical of seeing them as sort of one directionally trying to impose Christianity to Koreans, no matter if they are interested in or if in what way that they could understand. And also, in their missionary reports, definitely you can see a lot of derogatory sort of sentiment there. But nonetheless, as I read many different missionary reports, I was deeply touched, and I feel the whole picture, the whole stories, it's far more complicated. And as the one missionary I highlighted here, James Gale, and he was definitely in deep love of Korean people and the culture. That's the reason soon after he arrived, he actually decided to change his clothes to Korean, and he decided to eat Korean food, even though it's extremely challenging to him. And also he started to learn Korean language, and then he started to make friends with every Koreans from different sectors. So those are the part that deeply touched me. And then in the future, I want to continue to do my research about the legacy of U.S. missionaries. Definitely, I want to see both sides, but I want to find my way of trying to be a little more nuanced of how to see of their legacy to Korean history and the culture. Yes, we still have to give credits of those people bringing a modern education, cultural, and modernism to Korea. But on the other hand, why exactly and how exactly they did it, and to what way that Korean people can appreciate and accept and embrace that. So that's a very complicated question. So number two, it's about legacy of Kim Kyu-sik. To be honest, before I started working at Roanoke College in 2006, and before I started working there, I don't really know much about him, so I barely heard of his name. But after I started working there, I did a lot of research about him. The more I researched about him, the more touched I feel he's a person not of his period. He's a person who really had foreseen like 50 years ahead of his time, and that's the reason he was never popular of his time, because of his time it's more of the confrontation of so-called capitalism versus communism, and he was diehard anti-communist, but nonetheless his deepest concern is try to not to let Korean War happen. So because of that, he tried to talk with North Korea, and he wanted to find a way to find a united front so that Korean people did not need to suffer war. And unfortunately, of his time, that was really not the time that the people want to pay attention to this kind of neutral compromising way, and that's the reason the United States also did not pick him, did not want to support him to be the leader of southern part of Korea. But nonetheless, I mean, 50 years later, 100 years later, I mean, when we think of him, still, I think, I mean, definitely, I actually get to meet his granddaughter. I met her a couple times when I visited Korea, and also she said she shared a lot of her like a personal family history of how do they think of their grandfather in the history of Korea. So she said when she was little, she almost never really wanted to talk about her grandfather, because in South Korea there is a still deep misunderstanding of him. Just because he wanted to work with or talk to North Korea, many people, they actually thought him to be a pro-communist. So he was actually kidnapped, abducted to North Korea, but many people, they rather want to say that he walked voluntarily to work with North Korea. So he died on his way taking to North Korea. So because of that, her family never really want to talk about him. It was only until late 1980s, early 1990s, finally people start to think of his legacy in a more like a nuanced way, in a more like a rational way. So that today, I think there are more and more people trying to see the value of Kim Kyu-sik and also of his approach to North Korea as well as inter-Korean relationship. But that was definitely not the situation of 1950s, not the time that when he was alive. So finally, I'm glad that 100 years later, we can see him in a very different angle, in a different perspective, and definitely we can see more of his positive inspiration in terms of inter-Korea relationship today. Thank you.
Such an intriguing discussion we had. I think we have one or two questions. We have time for one or two questions. Is there any other question or comments? We have in the back.
Hi, Dr. Chu. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Hari Chan. I'm a policy analyst for the Department of Labor Women's Bureau. I especially thank you for including a gender lens and including Lee Chae-yeon in your presentation. My question for you today is, during your research, and adding that gender lens, like what was the most surprising thing that you learned when you were, discovering Ichayan?
Oh, thank you very much. That's another very interesting aspect of my research. First of all, I was surprised that the women, the wives of the diplomats, they were taken to the United States. But of course, I was more impressed that how well she was handling the role of being a spouse of a Korean diplomat. And then, so again, she really studied very hard of English, and it's obvious that her English is not only good, it's much better than maybe many of other like male diplomat of Korean diplomats of her time. And also, she definitely knows the expected gender role in Korea, but once she came to the United States, she looked around and she definitely want to change and to adjust to the home country. Another interesting part is that her husband, he is also very supportive. I mean, he could be like the old Korean man is like, oh, you just stay in the quarter and then I'm not taking you anywhere. It turns out that he took her everywhere, and then that's also the reason she came to Ronald College. And then so Ronald College president at that time, he wrote a very interesting memoir of hosting her. So it's very interesting. So the college, obviously, Salem is, even today, it's still a very small area. I mean, we rarely have any Asians there, and just think about 130 years ago. I mean, there's no way you can see any Asians or Asian diplomats, right? So it turned out that Ronald College, when they prepare for hosting, they worried more of Mrs. E than Mr. E. So of the early worries, they talk about, oh, can she really speak English? And what does she eat? What will she eat? And what will she wear? And of this, and then at the very end, after hosting her, and then the local community as well as Ronald College faculty, they just fell in love with her. I mean, her English is superb, and she was funny, and she brought multiple like American clothes. And it's also interesting, when she was in DC, she was basically obligated to use Korean clothes, but when she came to Ronald College, she actually brought many like American clothes, and she constantly changed the clothes to fit different venues, and then the local people definitely were deeply impressed with her. So that's another thing. But at the end, so she was very active in the United States. And then I checked all the U.S. newspapers report about her. There are over 100 references of her. So definitely she was super, super popular, and mostly in a very, very positive way. But on that hand, unfortunately, once she returned to Korea, I mean, there is no any single Korean reference of her, and then it's unfortunate that we don't even know her full name. So, because she was basically remembered as Mrs. E, as a wife of her husband, not by herself.
I think we have a question from the virtual audience.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Xu. We have a couple of questions. The first one, after World War II, was there any point in a proposal for general elections for all of Korea? If so, why was it not implemented? Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. That's another very complicated questions, and one of the old-time mystery for modern Korean history as well. Definitely, there had been always proposal for this kind of a general election. However, at that time, because Korean Peninsula has already been divided but to northern and the southern part, and then if we think of today's Korea, never been fully free from the influence of United States, Japan, China, or Russia. It was only even far worse of that time, because 1945, physically there are troops from Soviet Union in Northern Korea, there are troops from United States in Southern Korea. So united election, it has always been a proposal. It has always been an ideal way to get a united Korean government, but because of the confrontation, because of the prelude of the Korean War, the Cold War, it's just not realistic. So what we know is that from 1945 to 1948, despite both sides, they were trying to propose this the general election, but both sides also know that they are not going to give in. So North Korea, they had their election first, and then they had their premier, and then southern part of peninsula, they also had their in-name, it's general election, but it's only for the southern part of Korea, and they elected Sung Man Lee. So, thank you.
I think it's time to finish our first session. We'll have a short break before next session. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you.
Thank you.